What can I say about my man C.S. Lewis? Wow, talk about a hero. I first read one of his books in grade 5, and it transported me into a whole new world, the world of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We were assigned to read that in grade 5, and oh my goodness, it just lit me up. I was amazed. He was a master storyteller, and he felt all the great myths and all the great stories ultimately found their meaning in the greatest story, the story of redemption. When Darren Emery and I went to Ireland to visit his ma and da, we went to Belfast where Lewis was born, and they had a museum and the C.S. Lewis Square that we went to visit and just do some fun research there. And I felt very privileged to go there and be in the same area where he once was. Clive Staples Lewis. But you thought a C stood for Charlie. Yeah, Clive. Clive Lewis, born in Belfast in 1898, November. And he died right around my birth in 1963. He held academic positions at both Oxford and Cambridge. And he's best known for works like the Chronicles of Narnia, as I mentioned, the Screwtape Letters, amazing, profound apologetic work called Mere Christianity. Also, Space Trilogy thing he did, and other books. A Problem of Pain was one of his first Christian books published, just dealing with why is there suffering in this world if God is so good. So him and J.R. Tolkien were good friends. J.R. Tolkien, of course, is the author of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Hobbit, and many other characters in Middle-earth. They were close friends, and they first met in 1926. And Lewis, though he was raised a Protestant, was what he would call himself a solid or avowed agnostic, meaning one could not know if God existed or not. And Tolkien was a devout believer. And anyway, Tolkien, he had this group that they had called the Coal Biters, and they had met and discussed theology and myths and those kind of things. And he invited and let in, so to speak, Lewis into this group. And in that group, they would discuss Norse theology, myths, really, myth theology, Volsung legend. They weren't afraid to discuss these myths and legends of gods and goddesses and those kind of things. And Lewis, while he was making his kind of living as a tutor in the classics, he took on this view after meeting with these guys for quite some time. He took on a view that, well, maybe the Christian myth conveyed conveyed the truth as much as a man could know it. That's kind of what he thought. By 1926, he had moved further, and he thought that, maybe the search for his joy, the search for all joy, could be found in a search for God. And so he was what he called very reluctant convert to belief in a God. As I said, Tolkien was a devout believer, and he was a person of art and intellectual prowess and vigor, and he would challenge Lewis on his views, and he would challenge him to surrender to Christ. After a while, he said he had a simple faith in God, but he couldn't grasp a hold of the idea of the crucifixion and the resurrection, that one man could give his life for all. And they would meet together and walk together and coffee together and literally spend hours discussing these things and discussing different preachers, G.K. Chesterton, etc. And one day in Oxford, Lewis was challenged by Tolkien and by this other friend of his, kind of a guest lecturer in literature, a guy named Hugo Dyson. And together these three were walking, and they were talking about myths, and Lewis sort of encountered the idea that all the pagan mythologies of sacrifice, maybe he could see a pattern developing, pointing to what could be the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ. When he argued that myths are all fiction, they're all lies, Tolkien immediately said, no, they're not. And it shook him a little bit. And he said, just as true as words that, that help, like this is a book, this is a remote, like words and speech, they put their inventions and about objects. So myths are inventions about the truth. And Lewis said, you mean the story of Christ is a true myth? They continue to discuss these things over and over again, Christian faith more and more. And for Lewis, he said, I was moved from an agnostic to a believer in God to a definite believer in Christ. Why is he a hero for me? I think it has to do with his love of story and imagination, and how Lewis, and Tolkien for that matter, could weave and intertwine the truth into their stories to bring about revelation of who Christ is. I didn't read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with any understanding of it being an allegory for something greater. When I first read that, I had no idea. It wasn't actually until I read it maybe once or twice, maybe even 3 times, before I realized this is a bigger picture going on here, that Narnia and Aslan and the White Witch who claimed to be the Queen of Narnia, and the Stone Table and the death and resurrection of Aslan, all that. I didn't have a clue that was about Christ. And when I did, it was like, oh my goodness, I had to read it again. And then it was like, oh, now I get it. Oh my goodness. It's kind of like when you watch the movie The Sixth Sense, and then you realize at some point that Bruce Willis's character, Malcolm Crowe, was already dead. He was dead throughout the whole movie, spoiler alert. And then you go, oh. And then you gotta look back and watch it again, and then you're like, yeah, now I get it. So once C.S. Lewis gave his life fully to Christ, he used his gifts, he used his talents, he used his developed skills to glorify Christ in everything he did and everything he wrote. I can't say I totally agree with everything that Lewis stood for or landed on, but that's okay. He ran his race well, to the best of his ability, experiencing the joy of marriage to a woman, 1956, Joy Davidman, who died 4 years later from cancer. So he experienced joy, he experienced pain, he experienced life, but he knew joy. And he said rather to give his love and his life for that than not, even though it was also painful. He died on November 22, 1963, which is a significant date for a lot of people because John F. Kennedy was assassinated on that day. In fact, just a couple hours before Kennedy was killed, C.S. Lewis collapsed and died in his home. His death was really kind of overshadowed by the death of John F. Kennedy. But on the day he died, the Saturday Evening Post was going to press for their December issue, and they had an article from him called "We Have No Right to Happiness." Oh, that's interesting. You can look it up. We have no right to happiness. And really the gist of the article was, no, we don't have a right to happiness, nor to anything else. But we But God offers us it. God offers us love. God offers us hope anyway. And as one reviewer said, so grab them. Grab his love, grab his hope, grab them and only them, and then settle in for a life that only God can provide. That's some thoughts worth thinking about. C.S. Lewis, part of the great crowd of witnesses, run his race well and may continue to cheer us on in the race we run.